All right. It looks like we are live, so I will go ahead and begin. Thank you all to who are joining us on Facebook. My name is Carolyn Gillespie with the Mississippi Humanities Council. Welcome to our second ever virtual Ideas on Tap. For those of you who have not joined us before, Ideas on Tap is the Humanities Council's monthly happy hour discussion program where we tackle relevant, important issues in a casual setting. So we encourage people in normal times to come join us at a bar or a restaurant to grab a drink and some snacks and sit down and hear from experts on any given subject and to engage in civil discourse. So it's you know, an important part of Ideas on Tap is really kind of coming together to hear different ideas from different people who you may not agree with and who you know may not have heard from before, but really to kind of share ideas and get some common ground. You know, one of the benefits of this pandemic, one of the silver linings that we've got is that we are now able to reach beyond our normal geographic barriers. So instead of just reaching people who are able to come out to a restaurant in Jackson on a Tuesday night, we're reaching across city, state lines. And so welcome to all of you who are not in Jackson or even in Mississippi. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's program is the second part in a series on systemic racism in America. You know, we have taken a break from Ideas on Tap for the last few months, and we wanted to come back when we knew that we could really provide input on important issues. And we felt like conversations on systemic racism was what needed to draw us back together to have these virtual conversations. Last month, we talked about systemic racism in policing and criminal justice. And this month, tonight, we'll be talking about systemic racism in education and housing. To do that, we've got some fantastic panelists joining us tonight. I'm just going to very quickly introduce them. We've got Dr. Corey Wiggins, who is the Executive Director of Mississippi NAACP. To my, I guess on my left, to my right is Rebecca Sevilla, who is the former Executive Director of EdBuild, which is a policy and research organization that focused on education funding models, and kind of the inequality that we see in America's education system. And Rebecca is recently finished with EdBuild, and so we'll be hearing about some of her other projects and what she's going to be doing now. And then below me, I see Travis Crabtree, who is an urban designer for the City of Jackson's Planning and Development Department, and also the project manager of a project that the city is doing called Fertile Ground, which I'm sure that Travis will talk more about in the context of how it relates to systemic racism in housing. And then below me to my right is Dr. Tamika Simmons, MHC board member and director at Delta State University of the Local Government Leadership Institute. Tamika, I think I got that right off of my memory. Tamika is joining us as a return moderator. She moderated last month's panel, and we were so pleased having her part of the conversation and really kind of helping guide us all through the conversation, that we were glad that we were able to get her back tonight. So I will say quickly before we begin that, as a disclaimer, that the thoughts expressed by our panelists tonight, while we very much appreciate them being here and sharing them with us, are not necessarily those of the Mississippi Humanities Council. For those of you who are joining us who haven't liked our Facebook page, please go ahead and give us a like, and you can stay updated on future Ideas on Tap programs and other MHC programs and kind of what we're doing in the virtual world now. So I will go ahead and pass it over to Tamika, who will get us going. And also for those of you who are watching on Facebook, please feel free to drop questions and comments into the comment section of the live stream, and we'll be passing them through to the panelists so that we can get your questions answered during the program. So with that, I will pass it over to Tamika.
Thank you, Caroline. Good evening, everybody, and everybody that's joining us online. Good evening, good evening. We are so excited to be in this second series, this second part of our conversation around systemic racism in America. As Carolyn indicated before, we did have a conversation around policing and criminal justice on last time. And so now we're talking about systemic racism in the context of education and housing. And so before we begin, I know I'm from Mississippi, and so I want to throw it out to the panel to ask, you guys are from Mississippi. Where exactly are you from? I'm representing Jackson, Mississippi, but I live in the great city of Greenville and I work in the great city of Cleveland. So why don't you guys share real quick where you are in the city, in the state of Mississippi, or where you're from in the state of Mississippi, and I'll let our folks joining us online type in the comment where they are joining us from in the state of Mississippi. So we'll start with you, Dr. Wiggins. Tell us where you're from.
Hey, I'm born and raised from Hazelhurst, Mississippi, about 30 minutes south of Jackson. And I always make sure I tell folks that I grew up 9 miles outside of the town of Hazelhurst. I'm currently right now actually sitting in Jackson at a soccer field watching my kid run around and burn off some energy on the soccer field. So that's why I'm taking this call from the inside of my truck as well too.
All right, Rebecca.
I am not from Mississippi. I am born and raised New Jersey. Went to school in South Carolina, so have spent a little bit of time in the South. Spent about 2 years actually working with folks in Mississippi between 2016 and 2018. Can't wait to get into that conversation. But as Senator Hobb-Bryan will remind you, I am the woman from New Jersey, so I'm proudly owning that.
All right. Okay, so what about you, Travis?
I'm originally from Dallas, Texas, but moved to Mississippi when I was younger, and then moved to Detroit, lived in Detroit and studied and went to school in Detroit, and I've found my way back to Jackson, Mississippi. So I'm sitting here in Jackson, Mississippi.
All right, well, wonderful. Looks like we've got a little bit of flavor from all over the state and the nation. And so with that, I'm going to invite our panelists to just kind of tell us a little bit about the work that you do and how that intersects with our conversation tonight around systemic racism in education and housing. Rebecca, I'll start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure. So I had the pleasure of leading an organization called EdBuild. We constituted in 2014 and recently closed our doors in June of this year. It was bittersweet. One of the things that we kind of did two things. The first was that we worked directly with states to figure out how to make their school funding formula not just more progressive, but more racially tuned. And the second thing that we did is we did this work that we called National Voice, where we attempted to elevate into the national dialogue the problems that come from the way that we fund public schools. Largely, we broke that down into 3 different categories. Funding is arbitrary, it's outdated, but most importantly, our school funding system creates the incentive to segregate along community and race and socioeconomic lines. One of our most premier releases was called 23 billion. It identified that there's a $23 billion gap between what predominantly white, predominantly non-white school districts receive in order to educate their children, even though they educate the same number of students. And so what it told us was the way that we're funding schools, even though a lot of experts will tell you we have a progressive funding system, it's not translating into the way that it's playing out for folks of different races. So I'm excited to be joining the conversation from that perspective.
Awesome, awesome. Travis?
Yeah, I'm an urban designer for the City of Jackson Planning Department. I'm a project manager for the Fertile Ground Project, which is a project that focuses on using public art as a tool to talk about the problems with food access within the state of Mississippi and within Jackson specifically. I'm also the creative director at the Eco Shed, which is a mixed use incubator space that's sort of a a research center for supporting creativity and sustainability. A lot of my work focuses sort of around developing public space interventions that provide access-based urban design solutions in resource deserts and neighborhoods that have been divested in. The areas of access that I work within is obviously food, health, learning, mobility, and developing solutions sort of around those four core access sectors. Over the past 2 years, I've been really working within food access and working all across the city of Jackson within different spaces to try to creatively design food access sort of interventions within neighborhoods, particularly ones that are food deserts within Jackson and on the western side or the southern side of the Redline within Jackson.
Awesome, thank you. Corey.
Yeah, sure. So I come to this, I guess, conversation in a couple of different frames. I've always joked I've had a lot of different careers, from working as a health fellow in the U.S. Senate to an advisor in the Mississippi State Legislature. I'm a former faculty member at Jackson State University in health policy. And prior to coming to this role for executive director for NAACP, I served as senior vice president of policy at Hope Enterprise Corporation, Hope Credit Union, which is a community developed financial institution. They did a lot of programmatic work around housing access, really looking at neighborhood sort of level interventions and how do you create access to more opportunity in economically distressed communities. You know, as I did that work and began to sort of think about like, how do you get towards these root issues, is that it's very hard to develop more equitable systems without keeping people centered in that conversation. Which sort of really translates to the work that I do at NAACP. I've been in this role for about 3 years now. And I always say I have the privilege of working at the NAACP here in Mississippi, where we're really trying to listen. And I say listen because we have people all across the state who are members of the NAACP representing their communities, talking about the issues. And folks know how they want their communities to look, feel, and smell. We just have to listen to them, create the space, and allow them to develop those communities and support them in developing their communities in that way. So definitely looking forward to this conversation and really sort of bringing this holistic frame to how we think about these issues around education and housing.
Awesome, thank you so much. So as you guys can see, we've got an awesome panel and we've got a lot we want to really get into tonight. So let's just jump right in. And my first question has to do with systemic racism, right? How do you define systemic racism in the context of education and housing in America? And how does it present itself? And so as you're thinking about that, I want to encourage our folks who are listening in. Some of you have children who have already started school. And if your kids are already in school, whether that's homeschool, face-to-face school, or online school, and I know our 7th through 12th graders are at home right now or virtual right now because of the governor's order. But if you've got kids that are at school now, just go ahead and type school in the chat. And if you're not in school, if your kids aren't in school yet, then just type not yet, right? We can kind of get a feel of who's joining us. But let's go back to this systemic racism. And I want you to address that question in the context of your work and what it is that you do. So how would you define systemic racism and how you see systems of racism in the context of your work? Let me start with Corey on that.
Yeah, I think there's all these different academic and sort of textbook definitions of systemic racism. And I think what I tend to go to, one is this conversation around the experience of a group of people and connecting that experience of a group of people to this idea of power. Oftentimes we talk about systemic racism, we talk about these issues in the context of so many different types of analogies, but I think at the root of it, we're talking about power. We're talking about systems that empower some and systems that disempower others. You're talking about a constant struggle for equity or outcomes where you're not trying to limit opportunities of a certain group of people based upon their race, their gender, their sexuality. And so I think when you think about and what that looks like, it shows up all across all of the systems and institutions that we come in interact with. You know, whether it is intentional actors that are trying to maintain these systems of limitations, these systems of limit opportunity, or whether it is implicit bias that has been codified and baked into these systems and institutions by design structures. So, you know, I think for me, when I think about systemic racism, there's not just one thing that you point to. It is a group of processes that results in outcomes that limit opportunity for communities and folks, particularly communities of color, in a way that is already limiting what they can achieve and what they can do, because they're starting way back, right? They're starting from a disadvantage and the point of place. And I think so often in our communities, I heard the statement, and my family talk about it all the time, is just, look, just don't hurt me, right? If I'm trying to advance, don't put in barriers that limit me from doing what I do. At the very least, just stand aside. And I think so often we think about how systemic racism show up is that those institutions, barriers that are there, that are put there, that are intentionally limiting opportunity. So that's kind of how I sort of think about it, and how we unpack it. I think there's a diversity of strategies that you use to unpack what it is and make sure those systems and institutions work better for people.
Thanks. Rebecca, talk to us a little bit about how systems of racism show up in your work.
Yeah, so speaking to Dr. Wiggins' point here in terms of intentionality, right? So I think that there are very few people who can actually point to a school funding system these days where you could say that there is intentionality that is built into the way that the state is distributing resources that intentionally leave students of certain colors behind. However, the entire system is built on this historical, like a history of intentionality, right? That started from a very intentional set of racist policies that dictated where people could live. And then a very intentional racist policies related to where students could go to school. And then what we did is we built our entire way of funding education on top of those two very intentionally racist sets of policies. And so as a result, when you take a step back and look now, people seem to think that, like, our school district borders were ordained by God, or our school funding system has just always been gifted to us and we're just tinkering around the edges. And what is inherently known now to us is that this system of school funding has been built on top of intentionally racist strategies around where people can live. Our school district borders were ordained by God, or our school funding system has just always... Am I hearing myself back again? That's my worst nightmare. So anyway, so the bottom line is that I think that for me, systemic racism is when we have a system in place that has maybe not intentionally been built in that one specific aspect of that system, but is building upon the intentionally racist policies of the past, and that thing itself does nothing to reverse the effect of the intentional system of the past.
Right, thank you. Let's go to Travis here. Talk to us a little bit about your work and where you see systems of racism.
Yeah, so throughout my work, I look at systemic racism really through a spatial lens. So if you think about white flight and the communities that it produced that have been strategically divested in America, we've set up most Black communities to fail, just in a very, very sort of deep strategic way. We don't offer the same access to resources within most Black neighborhoods as we do white neighborhoods. since I work mostly within the food space, I like to talk about housing sort of from a food perspective. If a grocery store is 5 miles away, but fast food, liquor stores and corner stores are less than less than a mile away, people are more likely to eat that cheap, addictive, unhealthy food right next to them. Especially when you have poor transit and low car ownership, which is a lot of communities within Jackson. I think that there's a lot of structures with economic structures with corporations that are very parasitic within a lot of these neighborhoods that are profiting off of people and capitalizing off of certain populations in a very sort of strategic way. So I'm sort of a fan of talking about creating neighborhoods and 20-minute neighborhoods which is this concept around being able to have access within your neighborhood to food, health, learning, and mobility systems, which has not been the case. Most of these neighborhoods are sort of resource deserts. I think that it's all placed around housing. I think at the end of the day, like where you live really determines what your future is going to be and like what your environment is going to be and where you're growing up. So I'm super excited about sort of the future on how we can redesign a lot of our communities to really support Black lives and really try to accelerate, figure out interventions that can accelerate people and uplift people versus cause more issues. So
thanks for that. And Travis, I'm gonna kick it back to you on this next question, because as we've all mentioned in addressing this first item, we're talking about systems that don't just pop up overnight. These are structures and policies and actions that are older than all of us and older than most people alive today, right? These are structures that go back to the founding of our country and the founding of our state and the founding of our educational system and our public education system. And so we really need to understand the historical context there and how that matters. Oftentimes, conversations around systems and racism in systems is dismissed as a thing of the past. Well, Rebecca, as you pointed out, everything in the past has implication for what we do today. And so, Travis, this is where I want you to kind of highlight a little bit more and kind of go a little bit further around how the history of how these systems have root in the work that we see today.
Yeah, so from a planning perspective, one policy that I like to point out during these sort of conversations is redlining, and redlining is probably one of the most damaging policies that's led to a lot of the systematic racism that we see today. Obviously, redlining is built on the foundation of the things that happened beforehand. But you can clearly see today, like where infrastructure like highways, railroads, bridges, other large institutions create fences and prevent integration of communities, and is really sort of separating our different communities from interacting with one another and having access to the same opportunities that most white communities get. So, I think within planning, there's just been so many mistakes. And, when you go through urban planning school, you understand the different phases of, what we did during these different times. And redlining is, was a common practice where, banks were providing subprime mortgages that were sort of these parasitic mortgages within neighborhoods they knew that Black communities could not pay off. It also demarcated where to invest in a grocery store or not. So there are specific zones when people when corporations go to decide where they're going to place a grocery store, they know where not to place a grocery store based on the higher risk level that they sort of have assessed on those within their analysis. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm super excited on how do we break those boundaries. And a lot of the work that I've done has been sort of positioning and trying to bring communities together within these spaces to try to, have these conversations about, access and, what policies can we create from, just the high level of community engagement and bringing different communities to the table and bringing them together.
Right. And Rebecca, so I'm going to tilt to you now because Travis, as you bring up redlining, we have an audience member that has also asked about, redlining, the intersection of redlining in urban areas and the taking of rural farms in the South and leaving folks without opportunity for physical mobility or social mobility. And so that creates the canvas on which the opportunities are painted for our children today. And so, Rebecca, can you talk a little bit about, again, in the context of history, how what we see today is colored by those historical moves? And then how should we start to position ourselves today, as Travis alluded and stated, to start to make a turn so that we are headed toward a more equitable space than where we've been in the past? And I know that's kind of all over, but just kind of share your thoughts around that.
Yeah. So I'll pick up on the redlining and moving forward, right? So we redlined our communities and created, along the way, we created very racially dense and impoverished areas, right? That were divested, like deeply divested areas. And then what we said is, and now we're going to fund schools based on the wealth of that community. Mm-hmm. So we intentionally sent folks to certain places and took resources out of those places, drew lines around them and said, now you're responsible solely for funding your schools, right? And so then we ended up with a series of state level and federally, level kind of court cases that really challenge that. Should we really have a school funding system that is built simply on the wealth of the community? And what courts have said time and again, no, we shouldn't have that system, right? No, that's an unfair system. But in every single state, instead of inherently changing the way we fund public schools, right? Instead of saying we will no longer fund schools based on locally collected and locally governed property taxes, what they said instead was the state should try to make up the difference. And so what you have now is a system throughout the US. And if you want to talk about Mississippi, we could talk all day about some of the stuff that's happening in Mississippi school funding formula, but you have a system where there is increasing inequity that's happening at the community level. And the state is running to try to fill in the gap, and they will never be able to fill in the gap so long as those borders still exist, right? So we have this self-feeding kind of loop in terms of what the community themselves can do to raise money for their own schools, and thus how dependent they are on the state. The more dependent they are on the state, the more dependent they are on the decisions that the state makes related to school funding and everything that topples down from that.
So Rebecca, I'm gonna have to dig deeper with you here, right? So let's talk a little bit about that, because we know what challenges exist in the state of Mississippi around education. We know what the history has been in the state of Mississippi around funding for public schools. And so I want you to unpack that a little bit, because when we talk about this loop, right, this cycle that we see, what's your view around, what's some of the deepest challenges, right, that we see in the loop? and ways in which we can start to disrupt that loop. And then I'm going to come to you, Corey, because I want to keep that same line of thinking around how do we disrupt the loop. But I'm going to start with you, Rebecca, because you stepped in it. So I'm going to
I always step in it. It is a story of my life. Okay, so the way that school funding in Mississippi, like in other states, works is that there is a formula that says this is how much you should get in order to run your schools. And it's based on, in some cases, what the students look like in terms of their demographics, in some cases, what the teachers look like in terms of their tenure, et cetera. So that's how kind of Mississippi starts with a funding formula that is a hybrid of those two things. And it spits out how much money every jurisdiction should receive in order to run their schools. And then what they say is, we're expecting, based on your local wealth, that you're going to raise X amount of it, and we'll provide the rest. So what should be happening is lower wealth areas should be expected to raise lesser amounts, right? And then the state fills in more for those areas. There are two ways that this is breaking down. The first is that there is this thing called the 27% rule. Now I'm going to get real nerdy real quick. What the 27% rule says is that no matter how wealthy you are in the state of Mississippi, the state will always guarantee that we're going to give you 73% of the money that our formula says you need. So even if you can fund the entirety of your public education system off of your property wealth, the state will still give you 27%. So I'm going to lay that out for you. There's $120 million that is going to the wealthiest communities in the state of Mississippi because of this 27% loophole. And and this is Oxford, it's Madison, it's Pascagoula, it's places that have maybe not personal or residential wealth, but wealth on their property, like Pascagoula, right? That turns into the tune of $2,700 a kid more that Pascagoula is getting than a student who may need it more and has more learning challenges, right? So there's a single loophole in the funding formula that is sending state money to where it doesn't need to go. Now there's a second repercussion of that. Because Pascagoula and Madison and these other areas are getting more money from the state than the state's formula says they should get, they can keep their property taxes lower than other areas. So when you look at the property taxes on a district by district basis in Mississippi, what you'll find is that there's an almost direct correlation between what the millage rate is in these communities and how much money they're getting off of the 27% rule. So Jackson, for instance, has levied beyond a mill cap. They are overtaxing themselves to pay for their schools. And Madison is like 15% lower, right? And they can get away with that because the state's giving them this extra money in the formula. So then you think about the further compounding effect of that, where you have our lowest income areas that are taxing themselves at the highest rate just to keep up with a fundamental flaw in the funding formula.
Thank you. Thank you. That helps a lot. And I really wanted our listeners to be able to unpack that with us. So thank you for explaining that in just everyday words. So then the question, and I'm coming to you, Corey, how do we disrupt that, right? So if we understand the formula and we see what the impact is, we see where the loopholes are, we know where the needs continue to be, how do we start to disrupt the system in a way, again, where there is equity?
So one of the things I want to say too, in the context, and both what Rebecca and Travis sort of talked about, I think the historical context of where we are into the disruption piece of it is that what we're talking about is a system of institution that value the lives of some more than they value the lives of others. And that's not new. Like we don't wake up today and just like, oh, where did these systems come from? Why are we reacting like this as a state or as a country? And some folks, I call it sort of this historical amnesia about this idea of, we do forget that our system, particularly in the South, was built up off a system of free labor from enslaved Africans that were brought to this country. And we shifted from that system to a system of low-wage work when you get into sharecropping. And even now, when you look at across the South, when you're looking at unionized work, cooperatives, union density is some of the lowest in the country. And so when you talk about this idea of the ability to go and do a day of work for a fair wage, that's just something historically in our economic structure and systems institutions that we push back on across the South, and particularly in Mississippi. The other thing is, and the way Rebecca sort of laid out our funding for our schools is spot on, particularly when you think about essentially what we're also saying is that based upon this system, we're furthering disparities, we're furthering gaps. It's not even like we're saying that we have a system institution that does not work, the end, let's do something else. No, we recognize that, and we understand that based upon the funding formula, we're actually creating a further gap in access to resources to fund our education. Not to even get into the issue of that connection between redlining and then even when you're trying to create more access to housing, understanding how housing and access to housing really sort of provides for many communities a foundation for wealth creation, where you can get access to mortgages that's not predatory, right? Or even get access to, so these system institutions really come back to this idea of like, look, there are some folks in some communities and places that we value and some that we don't. And the other piece I want to add into this around is this idea of how narrative matters, and how we talk about communities, how we talk about these things. And so one of the example I'll use is that when we talk about our tax system in Mississippi, oftentimes you hear these conversations that some folks want to talk about, hey, you got these giveaways or handouts by the government, right? And most of the time you hear that conversation in the context of public benefit programs, SNAP, and other programs, child care subsidies. But then when you want to talk about corporate giveaways, you want to call it economic development. Well, heck, we talking about the same thing. You giving away taxpayers' dollars, but what you gonna call how is in the name of economic development? Like that, like narrative matters, right? Like let's pull back this cover of like this idea of who we are as a country and who we are as a state, and get to the root issues that we have to involve. So what does disruption? I think one disruption is like, look, let's take time to understand these issues and these systems and institutions, how they are impacting and affecting our communities, right? Let's sit at our dinner table with our families and have a real conversation and say, look, no, these systems and institutions are not right. They're not working right for everyone, and people are benefiting in different ways from them, and it's not equitable. So how do we engage, and how do we as a person sitting in their home, sitting right now watching this and thinking about what can I do? What should I be doing? And I get asked this question often, look, do what you can where you are with what you have, right? That may be having the conversation at your table with your family members about these issues, having conversations and real conversations about race. It may be having conversations about why it's important to vote. It may be important to talking about how do you show up and engage more as it relates to issues around education policy, as it relates to issues about housing policy. And that's not big things. That could be nowadays just turning on Zoom and listening on your school board meeting to understand and see what's happening, right? So I think disruption happens when we get more participating in this thing that we call democracy, and understanding that democracy is not only for those who are in power and who are in charge, but democracy in itself is for everyone to engage and participate in and have their voice heard. And I think that's part of this disruption of this system. And it's a start. We have a lot of folks across the state who have been doing this work for a lot longer than I have. And what I've seen is that we can make progress, but it requires everyone to make that sacrifice of time, attention, and energy to be part of this process of democracy.
So let me toss back for a second here to a question that we have coming in from the audience. and this is going to be a toss-up. Whoever wants to jump on this one can. What are the political barriers to changing our school funding system? Huh? Fun talk, right? And does the current moment create an opportunity for change? And so by current moment, I'm going to make some assumptions here. We all know what's the current climate around the Black Lives Movement, right? Catapulted by the murder of George Floyd, right? And how there's being this rallying cry across the nation around equity for Black folks specifically, right? So given that momentum and that energy that is pervading across the country and in Mississippi, is this a good time to start thinking around, you know, where can these changes kind of make an elevated leap or no? So the question again is, what are the political barriers to changing our school funding system, and does the current moment create an opportunity for change?
So I'll jump in first. So EdBuild tried to change Mississippi's funding formula. We worked for 2 years in the state, examined the funding formula, made a series of recommendations, and our recommendations were ultimately not accepted. New funding formula passed the House, did not pass the Senate. We didn't understand when we were walking in, and this is complete mea culpa here, the dynamics on the ground in Mississippi. And we didn't understand that Mississippi was engaged in a multi-year fight around the issue of adequacy of education funding, right? So the way that I tend to think about education funding is there's an equity bucket and then there's an adequacy bucket. Do we have enough, and is it going to the right people? And what I think had happened for so long in the state is that folks had become so tensely tied to the idea that the funding formula was not being funded at its full level. So they were tilting toward the adequacy issue, and there was really no kind of room to hear the fact that there was this major equity schism that existed in the formula, right? Because the idea is if you can find more money, then everyone benefits. That's an easy political solution. So the people that advocate for adequacy are taking the easy way out, because what they're saying is everybody needs more money. But the reality, I think today, especially with our current economic climate, is that that is not going to happen anytime soon. And so then the real question comes to, if you only have the same amount of money, or if you have a shrinking amount of money, what do you prioritize? Do you hold on to an inequitable system and wait until there's more money? Or do you try to change the system within the money that you've got? And if you're going to try to change the system within the money that you've got, forget about party lines. Then it's counting to who the winners and losers are. Bottom line. I saw a lot of folks in a lot of different states vote against a funding formula that ideologically they were aligned with, because it would have meant that their school district was going to lose $10 a kid and they couldn't bring that back home, right? So you can't rely on a party-based advocacy movement to change school funding. It has to be something that is tied completely to figuring out a structure so that you can get enough kids that need it to win in order to get it over the finish line. That's how to get it through the legislature. I'm starting to get I'm starting to believe that that doesn't happen, that like you just can't get this stuff done through the legislature. And if that's the case, that's where I think we get to our ray of hope, which is that we still do have the courts and we still do have other measures that we can take. So I know that we'll probably want to hold that for to end on a high note. But to summarize, I'm not sure that you can get this work done in a shrinking resource environment. I think that we're in a shrinking resource environment. And I think that the legislature, the folks who are in power in the education and appropriation committees in the legislature, are the ones who are benefiting off of the funding system right now. And I don't see how you move it.
Well, you know, one thing I add too, just additional, just context. I mean, the conversation around public education in Mississippi is a conversation that's steeped in racial context. even if you go to the history of public education in Mississippi, a willingness of the state legislature in the early beginnings to disband the public education system in the state of Mississippi just because of the thought that Black citizens were going to have access to public education or state supported education. And so even when you think about today, and there's been numerous attempts, I would say, that people across the state continue to ask this question and continue to find ways to chip away to bring some equity to the system around funding, even from the tune of having a ballot initiative and other work that continues to happen today. But what we've seen historically is that even when you start to build sort of these coalitions of folks who are willing to do the work, the issue is really sort of diverted back to race. And once you get into this conversation around race and access to quality of public education, then folks go to their corners. And I think when you see the politics of education, public education in Mississippi, even when you saw the ballot initiative, Initiative 42 that was ran in the state, one of the key issues or key ways that was sort of divide and conquer is that you started pitting this conversation around, well, Black children across the state is going to receive this at the expense of white children across the state of losing this. And so there's this sort of, I think, ideological conversation, but folks who feel as if the system that we have in place is adequate and it's enough will pivot real quick to a conversation around race to really sort of tear down a conversation that could be productive of how, and I think the productive conversation is like, how do you create an educational experience for children in Mississippi that provides them with what they need to go and be successful or productive or whatever it is, however you want to define it. But we get into all these other side conversations, get distracted from focusing on children.
I agree.
I try to find ways to be positive and optimistic during these COVID moments and during this sort of COVID time. And I think that one thing that I can see as a benefit during sort of this moment is just the technological advances we're going to sort of make within the school system. So we've been talking sort of about geography and how segregated geography and redlining has created this system of segregation. But within the virtual space, I think that those lines begin to disappear. And obviously there's the infrastructure side of being able to provide laptops and internet infrastructure and broadband within a lot of the neighborhoods within Jackson and the JPS system, but at the same, and within Mississippi. But at the same time, I think it opens up opportunities that starts to go outside of making this a spatial problem, learning a spatial problem. And I don't think, I'm not a huge believer in just like 100% virtual learning, but at the same time, I think that it's going to become more integrated within our society as we continue to have future pandemics, and we're going to have more. And, climate change is going to create more mass migration and disasters within communities. And we need to be prepared for how to respond to that in the future and to get ready to live a more virtual life. And I think that technology can be a tool to help deliver some more equity within the system, even though, like what you were saying, Rebecca and Corey, about the taxing within certain geographies and the resources that are going into those places. I think that the internet and virtual learning can definitely be a tool right now for us to catalyze and create a different type of education and be a little bit more democratic with how we are distributing knowledge to people. It's going to take a lot of work because we've been so behind. I mean, Mississippi is behind, but a lot of other places are behind. Like, I work at the Jackson Planning Department, and once the pandemic started, like, most of the permitting office work was all paper forms. Like, people were coming in and scanning and like it's just so behind, and it's not virtual, and it's so the system is just so inefficient, where I think that this has allowed us a moment to become a little bit more efficient with how we're dealing with some of these processes. And I would like to think that within the education system, we're going to become a little bit more efficient with being able to use technology as a tool to deliver education.
Thanks for that. And Travis, I'm gonna go down this road with you around COVID, because I'm seeing some audience member questions coming in around COVID and connecting the pandemic. Looking at how the pandemic highlights the inequities that are in place, right? So we already have a fractured system. We already have a system that's underfunded. There are loopholes that unfairly chip away at equity across the system. And so when you have a pandemic now, that we're in the context, we're in the state of Mississippi, just as in other rural spaces in America, we've got communities that are trying to get broadband access in the same way we were all working to get electricity 100 years ago, right? And so broadband has become something that is basic and people need it, but we still have communities where kids don't have access to broadband. And so now we're in this virtual space out of necessity, right? And that can create challenges or barriers for some students. And so I'm gonna pivot to Corey, since I'm looking at you right now, to talk a little bit about your view around COVID and how the impact of COVID on our current circumstances and situation in education and housing.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is this first is there's been a number of folks who've talked about sort of the housing, the health, the education, the equities as a result of COVID. But the thing is, these inequities existed long before COVID. Like, they're not new. Now there's been new attention, I think, drawn to these issues, and rightly so. And so even as we think about how do we address the challenges that students are facing as it relates to COVID, what I also hope that we don't do at this moment is once we are on the other side, right, of this pandemic, that we look at and say, okay, everything is fixed now, and we go back to the normal, and not realizing that we have to be responding to our children and to our communities around housing issues in a crisis mode right now, while also laying the foundation for the systemic change that we need to address those issues that's been longstanding, right? And so I want to make sure that we don't lose that. One of the things that I think I've seen, I talked to some family members. Look, Dr. Simmons, all my folks in Greenville, so I talked to some of my Greenville and Sunflower County folks up in the Delta, and we were just talking about education and public education and just how do you support children at this moment. Over the past couple of weeks, the NAACP on Friday afternoons at 4 on Facebook Live, we've been having this education conversation where we've talked to community leaders. Last week we talked to principals and superintendents. This week we're talking to students about how do you respond to these issues. I mean, I think to me it is a prime sort of point and example of why making sure that you have people who represent your interest are at the table when decisions are being made. So making sure that when there's a conversation about broadband, that you have people at the table who believe that access to broadband should be democratized in a way that allow people to access technology to do public learning, to do learning, making sure that that decision makers are making those types of decisions. When you're talking about how the structures for not only just the funding for public education, but how all of the policies that touch our educational institutions, ensuring that you have people at the table who are willing to look at it and say, look, what's going to be best for all children, right? Not just my children, but what's going to be best for all children. Because ultimately, when we're talking about how do we prosper in this state, when we talk about workforce, we're not talking about one segment of folk. We're talking about the whole state. We're talking about the workforce in our whole state. When we're talking about the economy, we don't just take out the Gulf Coast economy and set aside the central Mississippi economy. Like, no, we look at the whole economy in the state of Mississippi. So when we make decisions, we need people at the table who make those kind of decisions. And so what I would hope in terms of response to these issues is that, and you talked about this moment right now, is that we use this moment to ensure that the people who are representing us. So when we talk about voting, when we're talking about all these other issues, we have to be informed and make sure we're having people at the table who are informed, who are not motivated by selfish sort of ego and just grab mentality, but making decisions that's best for all Mississippians and not just a few. And I keep going back to that all and not just a few, because so many decisions that we've made in the history of our state has been made for a few while leaving out the masses of folks who really need help and need support.
Thank you. We've got a couple of more questions coming in, and I do want to pivot now in the last few minutes we have to especially focusing on some audience questions, but I also want to shift the conversation a little bit, because we know that we can go long past our time here talking about challenges, talking about the systems, talking about the barriers and the loopholes and the narrative and changing mindset. But where can we begin to have conversation around the solutions? One of the things you guys know, just being in Mississippi, and as a native Mississippian, I am well aware, again, of the negative narrative and talk around Mississippi. We're aware of it. But Mississippi has a lot of pros. Mississippi has a lot of good folks. Mississippi there are many initiatives that are on the ground and individuals that are on the ground working for a better Mississippi. So let's talk a little bit about and highlight some of that, right? So I'd like, and I'm gonna start with Rebecca. Why don't you talk a little bit about, some solutions that you've seen and in your work around dealing with some of the issues we've discussed tonight?
Yep. So it is my belief, and I think that our team came to believe this about 3 years into doing this work, that we're not going to fix this problem unless we fix school district borders. And so if we fix school district borders, it fixes two problems at the same time. The first is this difference in tax rates and people moving based on where their tax rates are, how well resourced their schools are, et cetera. And it also gives us more opportunity to integrate our schools because we have a broader student demographic from which to poll and staff and enroll schools. So the good news is that Mississippi is already doing that. I mean, it's a state that has changed more borders in the recent years than any other state that we've seen. And so there is a momentum here to say, we're not just going to change borders when it's politically, advantageous to us, but we're going to change them for efficiency purposes, sometimes for desegregation purposes, et cetera, right? So there is already kind of a system.
Hey, Rebecca.
Yeah.
When you were working on that work, were you looking at sort of combining the region, like the central Mississippi region? Is that right?
Yeah. So basically, here's the advantage. So Milliken v. Bradley was the worst Supreme Court lawsuit ever. And what it basically said was you can't desegregate across a school district border. This happened in 1974. So basically what it did is it upheld the school district border as the container for where kids stayed and where money stayed, right? And so the only way that we can go about changing that is to reimagine what borders look like. And so we see that all the time. Anytime you want a new football stadium, 5 different counties come together to impose a special tax, right? So why can't we start thinking about changing our school district borders? We looked at a number of different options in Mississippi where you could still basically run your own schools. You could still have locally governed schools, but you just have bigger tax pools, right? The good news is Mississippi is already well ahead of the game on that, because one, you've already been doing it for other reasons. So border changes is something that's known in the state, right? It's not anathema to the way that it works. And the second is that there are already bigger school districts than a lot of other states. So there's like 118, 120 school districts in Mississippi. New Jersey has over 700. So like, that's the difference that we're talking about here, right? So it's a smaller scope of borders that we need to fix. And there's already some momentum that's been happening over the past 10 years around that. So my opinion is that that's a fundamental change that we can make that doesn't necessarily cost the state any money immediately, but sets in place a more equitable distribution of both resources and kids.
Thanks for that. Now, Travis, I want to pivot to you for a second, but to talk a little bit about city planning, because we have a question about city planning. But before I do that, Corey, I want to ask you about, because someone asked a question about census, right? So how can, when we talk about solutions, where does the census come in as a tool to allow us to move toward more of these solutions?
No, look, I'm glad somebody mentioned that as a comment. I mean, one of the things that we've been doing this year at Mississippi NAACP, along with our partners, One Voice, has been doing a lot of work about trying to get people to complete their census. We have some counties in the state who still are sort of really low, who we need to keep encouraging folks to complete their census. But when you're talking about resources coming to your communities, particularly resources that are connected to federal dollars, or even when you look at the data that researchers are using, economic development folks are using, planners are using, they're using census data to design and develop and really sort of create communities and support communities. So I think census is very important in that way. I would also just go a step further. I mean, for Mississippi has a long history of trying to ensure that African Americans, that Black folk in the state are represented across multiple levels of government, and so that brings on this conversation around redistricting, which uses census data to that's the process of drawing the lines in which people decide to run for elected office. And so as we're talking about this conversation about people voting, part of the process is making sure you got fair, equitable lines so that when you do go to vote, that your vote isn't diluted, or that you're making sure that you have an active say in how you want your communities to look, and how you want the types of decision makers who are leading your communities. So census, I think, is the core of it. It happens every 10 years. So we got this shot at it this go around, and then the data that's collected is the data that the planners and folks who are doing this work will be using for the next 10 years. So no, I think that is just one tool, I think, in the toolbox of things that I think that we can do as citizens. I did want to say something though, Tamika. You asked that question about Mississippi and a good thing. The thing I always go to is that, look, I'm born and raised here. I moved away for a little bit and came back. And quite frankly, there's no other place where I want to raise my family. You know, I get a chance to go back and visit my parents and spend time on land. I knew somebody asked a question about rural land and property land, also land that my great grandfather purchased in 1934. Our family have owned about 150 acres in Copiah County. Our family have owned that land since then. And I think back the sacrifices that they made and other members of that community made just to get to that point. Then there's no other place that I want to be and raise my family in Mississippi, and really be, like so many others, be part of where we want to see our state and our communities go to. So I think the good thing is that I've been fortunate that so many folks, while they talk about brain drain, but I've been also so grateful to know so many people who are deciding to stay here in Mississippi, stay in this state, who are young folks, young leaders, to be part of this change work that has to happen in this state to ensure that everybody has equitable opportunity.
Right. I know one of our mayors out here in the Delta, Mayor George Holland in Moorhead, has been in the local news just advocating for folks to complete the census. Like, if you do nothing else, complete census. You can do it online. You can fill out the form. Like you can do it on, there's so many ways you can do it now where you can do it before. And we want to at least meet our numbers response rate from 2010. And for the city of Moorhead, it's going to be the difference between whether or not they're a city or a town. And that matters big in terms of the type of support and funding you can get depending on the size of your municipality. So folks just need to be thinking about, there are always small things that you can do to make sure that you're pushing for equity. And the census is one of them. Travis, I want to pivot to you. We've got a few more minutes. There's a question that came in about achievable changes that can be implemented at both government and private business levels that change life outcomes regardless of neighborhood, and especially around city planning and real estate. What are your thoughts around how can we achieve equity in terms of, you know, what businesses can do?
Yeah, I want to speak quickly sort of to the census and us like drawing lines. We continue to draw these lines, and I want to see I want to do a little bit more research on your work, Rebecca, on what type of lines you guys were sort of drawing for the region and taxing for the region, because it seems that we continue to draw these lines, for tax economic purposes and then for political purposes. And you think about gerrymandering right now and who is in control of drawing these lines.
Let me just be clear. We didn't do like willy-nilly. What we actually did is, it's online too. You can look it up on our website, edbuild.org, but we modeled, if nothing else changed, what if we just taxed at the county level and distributed that money evenly? What we found is that 3/4 of kids in Mississippi, 2/3 of non-white kids would get more money, even if we did nothing else. So we were using pre-existing lines. We weren't, we could talk about how those pre-existing lines got drawn as well, but.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain level of arbitrary there, when you're drawing these lines, but I'm thinking more so for Central Mississippi being, 5 to 10 county region, and thinking about Jackson, being this core for this 5 to 10 county region, and it is not currently benefiting based off of this 5 to 10 county region. I have serious concerns as more Democratic and liberal based people continue to move to cities and move away from the suburbs. What sort of power people are getting sort of within the gerrymandering process of, trying to make cities not count as much as people try to move further and further sort of away from the suburbs. But some low-hanging fruit as far as like some things that we can do from a city development and economic development standpoint. I'll speak quickly about just one obvious low-hanging fruit thing that we could be doing is Mississippi is 1 in 3 states with a 7% sales tax on groceries. Literally most states don't charge a sales tax. It's super bad for our local farmers and our local food businesses because they can't get into these groceries because of the markup. We just need to abolish the grocery tax. The average Mississippian's paying $600 more each year on groceries. But yet Mississippi is the most food insecure state in the country. So, I mean, I think that's like sort of an obvious state level policy that we could definitely change. As far as economic development on the city level, I think we need to incentivize grocery stores and urban farming and other uses that we want, and learning and health and mobility resources within neighborhoods. We need to figure out a way to work with Hinds County and the city to, either provide tax incentives, property tax incentives, whatever it might be, to help these people, help entrepreneurs start up businesses that are going to be good businesses within these neighborhoods, not liquor stores, not plasma centers, not these sort of parasitic type of businesses that pop up like a fast food restaurant or whatever. I think that we can be encouraging economic development within our city to county level tax base. I don't really fool with the state stuff because I don't have a lot of faith with the state. I work with Mayor Lumumba, and then we have a pretty good relationship with Hinds County. So I like to think about the tools that we can and the different policies that we can start to incentivize the types of things that we want within these neighborhoods at that level. I think the state level becomes so much more political, and you're talking about a much larger geography. So yeah.
Yeah, I actually would firmly agree with that. In fact, from an education funding perspective, decentralizing state incentives around business is most important. Just a quick story here. Claiborne, I'm sure you guys are generally familiar with how Claiborne County is situated in the state. Long story short, there's a nuclear power plant there. The state basically incentivized the nuclear power plant to be built there. They sold it to Claiborne a while ago saying, you're going to have all of this new money for your schools. Look at all the property taxes that this nuclear power plant is going to bring in. The year that the power plant was operational, the state legislature exempted them forever from taxes. So now it's untaxable land. So Claiborne now cannot tax that land for their schools. So decentralization of state level business incentives is something that I think that we should all start focusing on as well.
And I think that like Mississippi Development Authority, MDA, one thing that they really focus on currently is trying to incentivize big businesses to come to Mississippi and big corporations that are going to provide a lot of jobs. But we need to be, I think that Mississippi is more of a small business entrepreneur state where we need to be incentivizing small business entrepreneurship and then putting resources into their pockets versus saying, hey, you've got 50 plus workers, we're going to offer you this tax incentive for this manufacturing plant. It's super old thinking in terms of just manufacturing and trying to support that and attract people like Amazon and these other large conglomerates to Mississippi, where we need to really be investing within these smaller businesses that are within these communities that care about the community supports that business. And I mean, I really think that's what I like about Mississippi, is because you have that relationship and that culture with that sort of small business. Everyone sort of knows each other, and I want to continue to support you during COVID times. Like, I'm going to go and utilize your restaurant and try to get to-go food as much as I possibly can, and that's going to help your employees. So I think just having that relationship is extremely, extremely important. And I think that Mississippi Development Authority needs to reorient their focus from trying to attract these larger companies and really invest in the small businesses.
So with that, go ahead, Corey.
Well, no, real quickly, I think that discussion itself really sort of summed up an example of how systemic institutional racism works. And part of what you're talking about in Claiborne County, and it's not just in Claiborne County, there are other places where you see this happening, has played out. But example of it is that part of this also has been this evolution, in a sense, of representation of African Americans in government, local and city government. And one of the ways that you dilute representation and power is that you start to do preemptive legislative type things that actually usurps or removes power from local officials, where you give more power to state officials. And we see this all across the state. We see this all across the South. As you've seen and grow more representation of communities of color in elected offices, who begin to be in spaces and places to start to control city budgets, county budgets, all these kinds of things. You pass legislation like in Mississippi that prevents local or city government to increasing a local minimum wage. You start to see other types of legislation that limit the opportunity of city and county government to make decisions that could actually bring more justice, equality, whether it's criminal justice policy, economic policy, health policy in their communities. And so I think when you talk about systemic racism, that example in itself it shows up how institutional systemic racism kind of creeps itself into policy decisions. And you wonder, well, why don't, you may have a majority African American and majority community of color asking, well, why don't our mayor do this? Or why don't our county supervisors do this? And may not realize, well, they can't do it because their state legislature has made it illegal for them to do it. But I just wanted to just point that around this issue of systemic institutional racism, how that plays out in that context.
Right. It's so many spaces where, like you guys are pointing out, where this exists. And it's important for us to have our eyes open, or as the kids say, stay woke, right? And we all have a civic duty of being aware of where the issues and the challenges are, and then do a little bit of soul searching to see, how can I help? How can I get involved? How can I make my Mississippi a better Mississippi, right? And so we're right up on our time, but I do want to give each of you an opportunity to kind of give one last charge, kind of one last word of encouragement for the folks out there listening, because the issues around racism and systems of racism can seem so big. And so with that, I'm gonna pivot to Travis first, then Rebecca, then Corey. We'll let you take it out, and then we'll kick it over to Caroline to close us out. So one last parting word.
Oh man. Yeah, I think that I'm super excited. I have to find ways right now to be optimistic about the future that we're building. And I'm super excited about the momentum that we have currently being in crisis mode and what that does to systems. I think that it's good for us to be within this mode, because I think that we're going to continue to have these crises, and they're going to become more extreme, and we've got to, redesign our entire system and communities from a spatial standpoint, but from a systematic standpoint. And from a designer standpoint, I'm super excited in what that looks like. I think that we can create learning, food, learning, health, mobility structures within Jackson that are more attractive for your kid to want to be within, or a community, or for an individual to want to be within, than living in Madison, Mississippi. Like, I really think that we can create something so creative and so innovative here that is so attractive to, just sort of be on the forefront. And I feel like I have to have that sense about me, just to keep me motivated, to keep me going, and to keep me thinking about, like, what are the possibilities. And one thing I run into with a lot of Mississippians, and not so much in Jackson, but I mean, there's a lot of people that are here that are tired, and they're like a little bit complacent in what this system looks like. But I'm like, I'm excited to sort of blow it up and do something really radical. And I'm just thankful that, I work within this administration right now, because I don't know if other administrations and another point in time would have allowed me to be able to do the very creative work that I'm doing. So thank you, Mayor Lumumba.
So I'll say this, I learned so much through our work at EdBuild by just endlessly asking why. So you see something that like just doesn't make sense or looks broken, and you're like, but why does that exist? Why does that border exist, right? Why is that funding structured that way, et cetera? I think one of the things that's happening right now, we have this special opportunity that's coming to the forefront through Black Lives Matter, frankly, through the response to this administration, et cetera, is that we have white folks who are starting to ask why about our society for the first time ever. And these are not, fundamentally racist people. They are people who just never asked why, because they were taking part in a system that inherently benefits them, right? And so I think that one of the things that we're seeing, and what I hope that folks who are watching this see, that there's an opportunity right now to engage in a conversation around why and questioning everything, because that's the root of rebuilding something completely new.
Look, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and to share and be part of this conversation. The thing that I would say is that I would be remiss if I just didn't thank our member volunteers of the NAACP across the state of Mississippi. And the reason I do that is because when we talk about what change looks like and how do we contribute and how do we do it, is that we have volunteers all across the state who show up just because it's the right thing to do. They don't get paid to do it. They go to and listen in on school board meetings, county supervisor meetings, when there are issues in school around disciplinary issues, or how you talk about restorative justice and how we discipline children in schools. Like, they are all doing these things across the state, not because nobody paid them to do it, because it's the right thing to do. And they think that these principles of fairness, equity, democracy are hold true. And so as people are thinking about, like, what do they do? How do they be part of this change? When we talk about the movement work that's happened throughout this year in response to the senseless murder of Black and brown women, men and women across this country, look, hey, if you're looking for a home or a place to do some of that work, NAACP would love to have you. I mean, it's an infomercial, but I mean, it's this idea of we get all the time. I get asked so many times, like, what can I do? And there's work to do and plenty of work to go around. And I encourage folks to get engaged locally, get involved with your local civic organizations, your local community groups, your community centers, whatever it may be, a local NAACP branch, to be present. If you can't be present, support those places financially, those institutions financially who are doing the work. And I think that's how we be part of this change. We have to get out of this idea of saying somebody need to go change the system, somebody need to go do this, and somebody else, and otherizing what change look like. No, stop otherizing what change look like. Ask yourself, what can I do right now? What can I do today to be part of what I want my community to look like? And that can look like anything you need it to look like within your capacity and your ability. So I think I would just leave folks encouraged in thinking about how they're showing up in that way, wherever they show up in their communities, and be part of this change that we've all talked about today.
Thank you guys so much, Corey, Rebecca, Travis. This has been an awesome conversation. Thank you to the Mississippi Humanities Council, everybody out there that's listening in. This is the charge. You may be wondering what to do, but what we know you can't do is nothing, right? We want a better Mississippi, and so you can't do nothing. And there are many organizations out there that are doing something. So align yourself somewhere with someone and something so we can move forward together. And with that, we're gonna wrap it up. Carolyn, it's all yours.
Thank you all so much for participating tonight. It was a great continuation of our conversation. So just a huge thanks to all of our panelists, and an extra huge thanks to Tamika for moderating not one, but 2 Ideas on Tap programs in a row. Fantastic job. We're very lucky to have you for Ideas on Tap and also on our board. For those of you who are tuning in who have not liked our Facebook page, please do so that you can stay up to date on future Ideas on Tap programs and other programs that the MHC is conducting and supporting. You can also follow us on Twitter. This video will be saved to our Facebook page, so if y'all are just tuning in late and want to be able to rewatch it from the beginning, you can do so on our Facebook page. It'll also be on our YouTube page. So there are plenty of ways to catch up on the video and all of the other programs that we've done and recorded. So thank you to everybody for tuning in tonight, and we will see you next time.